Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at our colloquium series. As I find is usually helpful, we are going to give another minute or two for people to still join and come in. And so I will start proceedings in another minute or two. All right. Thank you very much for joining today at the Learning in Hospital Areas Colloquium series. Just a quick note that today we are recording this colloquium talk, but it will be hosted on an internally facing site, and the recording will be available for about 3 months. And so before introducing our speaker today, I'd like to acknowledge that the psychology department, which is hosting this colloquium, is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. As we are meeting virtually today, I'd also like to acknowledge that here in the lower mainland of BC, we are also often on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and other Coast Salish peoples. Today's colloquium focuses on decolonizing higher education in Canada and examining how systemic barriers impact Indigenous students and professors. Discussions like this remind us that education itself, who has access to it, whose knowledge is valued, and where learning takes place, is deeply tied to histories of colonization and dispossession. For instance, I received my education in South Africa on land that rightfully belongs to the isiXhosa and Khoisans people. While apartheid was abolished over 30 years ago, educational, economic, and political barriers still severely restrict educational opportunities for Black and mixed-race South Africans. I share this reflection in the spirit of today's discussion as we consider the ongoing legacies of colonialism in higher education and beyond. With this in mind, I'm grateful to be here at UBC. I appreciate the land where I am and the land from where I have come, as they have provided and continue to provide me with many opportunities. By acknowledging that I'm on the territory of the Musqueam people, I understand that it is a privilege to be learning and working on territory that is not my own. With additional gratitude, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, on whose land our speaker joins today. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Cote Meek. Dr. Cote Meek, an Anishinaabe from the Teme Augama Anishinaabe, received a PhD in Sociology and Equity Studies in Education at the University of Toronto, and also holds an MBA and a BSc in Nursing, I believe, from Laurentian University. Currently, Dr. Cote Meek serves as the Director and Professor of Indigenous Educational Studies at Brock University. And from her work history, she has been a pioneer. She was the inaugural Vice President, Equity, People, and Culture at York University, where she led the development of the Decolonizing Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategy and York's Black Inclusion Strategy. She was the inaugural Associate Vice President, Indigenous and Academic Programs at Laurentian University, where she developed the Indigenous Sharing and Learning Center, the Mamweezing Indigenous Research Institute, and the Master of Indigenous Relations. Dr. Cote Meek has published widely on Indigenous research, education, and health. She has also co-authored and authored several important books, including Colonized Classrooms, Racism, Trauma, and Resistance in Post-Secondary Education, and co-edited Decolonizing and Indigenizing Education in Canada, Critical Reflections and Politics on Advancing Women in the Academy, and Perspectives on Indigenous Pedagogy and Education, Learning from One Another. Dr. Cote Meek's 27 years in education and her excellence within it has been recognized. In 2016, she was nominated as an Indigenous role model for the Council of Ontario University's Future Further campaign. And in 2013, she was the recipient of the YWCA Women of Distinction Award. She is highly regarded nationally for her work on indigeneity, equity, and inclusion in education. And it is our honor that Dr. Cote Meek, that you have agreed to talk to us today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you today, Dr. Sheila Cote Meek.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Simon. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. I wish I could be there in person, but virtual always works really well as a second stand-up. I'm just going to share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint. Just give me 1 minute. Is it visible now, Simon?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to skip ahead. I just also want to take a moment to introduce myself in my own language, which is Anishinaabe, and you did really well with the pronunciation, by the way, Simon, so that was good. Anyway, Bojo, Kwekwe, Semakwe, Dishnakas, Makwa Dodem, Temiagama, Anishinaabe. So my spirit name is Tobacco Woman. I come from the Bear Clan, and I come from the Temiagama Anishinaabe, which are the people of the deep water. And I'm a member of the Temagami First Nation, which is a small community in northeastern Ontario. It's an island community on Lake Temagami. And I also acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. And even though I am Anishinaabe, this is I'm still outside of my own territory. So I'm just grateful that I'm able to live and work in this place as well. So I was asked to talk about some of the work that I've done around decolonization. And a lot of my work focuses on specifically around post-secondary institutions or higher education. And one of the things that I think is really important in understanding decolonization is that I think it's really important that we back up a bit and talk a little bit about what colonization is. I think it's critical to understand colonization very deeply, to understand kind of how it operates, and some of the work that has to follow as a result of what we talk about in decolonization. And I know that the word decolonization, indigenization, both get taken up by the academy quite loosely. And always my fear or my caution is that people are not really understanding what the terminology means. So I want to just spend a little bit of time on defining colonization, or how I define colonization. So in my earlier work, in a book that I published in 2014 around colonization, I did a lot of kind of searching around what decolonization was and colonization was. And I came up with kind of 4 dimensions that are kind of critical when we look at colonization. And the first one is that we have to recognize that colonization was always about the land and the resources within the land. And Indigenous peoples were actually viewed as impediments to colonization. And so a lot of what happened to Indigenous people during the periods of colonization are that there were great efforts put to shift them off the land so that we could gain access to the resources. So the second dimension is that in order for colonization to advance the way that it did here in Canada, as well as many other countries, is that there had to be a specific ideology that existed that reduced Indigenous peoples to being inferior, subordinate, and then eventually dependent. And in my work, I talk about how that ideology is rooted around racism. And so racial hierarchies often put particular groups of people at the top end, and Indigenous peoples are usually found at the very bottom end of a racial hierarchy, because they are probably the biggest impediment to ongoing colonization and ongoing extraction of land and the resources within the land. The ideology also served to dehumanize Indigenous people. And this is where we see all of the pieces around white supremacy emerging, is around that ideology. The third dimension is that colonization always proceeds with a lot of violence. And in my work, I draw on Frantz Fanon in his work around, and he made the links between how colonization operates and it's linked directly with violence. And the fourth one that we have to recognize is that colonization isn't a thing of the past. It still remains it still remains ongoing today. And I think the biggest example that I often use is my own homelands, Temagami Agama Anishinaabe, which were the original lands of the Temiagama people, span some 4,000 square miles in northeastern Ontario. And now, through colonization, through the Indian Act, we were reduced to a community that was the size of 1 square mile. It's a teeny tiny island in the middle, kind of in the middle of Lake Temagami. And so we still are contesting that, and there's still ongoing land claims. So it tells you that the whole pieces around colonization are still evident today. So that's kind of like really a sketch. I spend like a whole chapter unpacking colonization in my book, but it just gives you an idea about the four specific dimensions. So when we think about decolonization, I want you to think about these kind of four dimensions, which probably could be unpacked each in a chapter of their own. Some of the results of colonization have been, we see that there's a lot of inequities that exist between Indigenous peoples and the general population in Canada. You know, we see it along health dimensions, around social, economic dimensions, that we see that what it's caused is, you know, this concept about people who have and people who don't have, or people who have greater health and less health, people who have greater access to resources and others that live in poverty. Access to education is similar, you know, like, and decision making. So, which I'll come back to later on in my presentation. Decision making and the ability to make decisions for one's own self as well as your people was largely taken away from Indigenous people through the Indian Act. When what the Indian Act did was shifted Indigenous people onto reserves, and they were confined to those spaces with little control over their own lives. Of course, I talked about resources. It's also resulted in high levels of violence, stress, and now there's a lot of research out there that talks about the intergenerational impacts, for example, associated with the residential schools. So in the book, which this presentation's largely based on, this was based on interviews that I did with Indigenous students as well as Indigenous professors. And just to add a little bit of extra to that, I'm also going out and interviewing students now as well as professors now post TRC to see whether or not there's been some changes. So I'll try to infuse a little bit of that kind of early research results that's coming through on that work. But just generally, education systems were one of the primary tools used to advance colonization. There were other tools as well, like government policy, the churches and missionaries and so forth, but education played a big role in advancing colonization with respect to Indigenous peoples. And so when we talk about the school system, then we have to think about, you know, how schools still remain very colonial in nature and the way that they were set up. And then the structures that hold like places like the academy in place are pretty strong. You know, like there's kind of like these old ways of doing things, or we've always done it this way. So it's very difficult for people to change and think about a decolonized system when they have a colonial system in place that works for a lot of people. It doesn't work for people on the margins a lot of times, and especially Indigenous people. And so one of the examples that I use about how colonization is still evident in a university system, for example, is, you know, you have to ask yourself about what gets taught in these systems. You know, who controls the curriculum, and who controls how it's taught, and who gets to teach it. And it's only more recently that we started to see a shift where we're seeing, like, for example, cohort hires of Indigenous peoples coming into the academy. But prior to this, probably, I would say probably the last 5 or 10 years, there were very few Indigenous people teaching within the university systems. And so even educational systems in and of themselves create a lot of inequities within their system. And so when we understand colonization, we start to ask questions about who controls education, and who controls research, and who controls the governance of an institution, and how a university operationalizes itself. Who makes decisions? So certainly not Indigenous people. They're probably far and few between Indigenous people, for instance, on boards of governors, or on senates. I don't think at my current university there's one Indigenous person that sits on Senate, and she's an administrator in a role like an associate vice president of Indigenous initiatives. But that's only been for the last 3 or 4 years at the institution I'm currently at. And that's only one person, so hardly makes a lot of waves in controlling any kind of decision making. And then who makes decisions around how resources are allocated within these systems? All these are kind of critical questions that we need to be thinking about if we're going to be thinking about decolonization and also indigenization. So decolonization then is really about, for me, stopping this ongoing colonization for Indigenous people, and at least starting to think about how do we undo that if we're going to decolonize, right? So, and one of the things that gets talked about, or I should say doesn't get talked about, is the land and the resources at all in the decolonization of educational institutions. So there's no talk about repatriating lands, even though a big part of the colonization of Canada was all centered around land. And we need to start asking our questions around whose land we're on, and going beyond the land acknowledgements that we're currently doing, which I think was a good first step, for institutions to start acknowledging that. But what more, when you think about decolonization, what more can be done around the land? If you remember from my definition, colonization had to proceed with a specific ideology, one that was rooted in racism. So of course, decolonization then is also about looking at how ongoing systemic racism continues to exist within institutions, and how it gets, perpetuated. Looking at ways to eliminate the violence and the high levels of violence that exist. And in my own work, I define one aspect of violence as being about racism, and because of how it impacts people. And some of my work kind of points to the traumatic effects that racism can have on individuals as well. And then there's the pieces around divesting of power and control that are attached to decolonization as well. So it's a little bit different than indigenization, which is really about specific processes of working with Indigenous people to support a deeper understanding of Indigenous peoples, their history, their culture, and so forth. And also about kind of creating spaces within the institution so that Indigenous peoples feel welcome and supported, and that they are actually reflected within the institution. And we see these two terms float around the institutions, and oftentimes I find they're used interchangeably actually, but they are a bit different. So in some of my work, I also talk about, the work that needs to be done as transforming. So if we think about approaching change to institutions, and we're focusing on decolonizing and indigenizing, we are actually working at transforming kind of a larger system. And I'm not going to get into a lot about transformation, but I just wanted to introduce it here as kind of a central concept around how you bring about change within an institution. So, okay, so, what did the students say? And also, what did faculty members say to me around what their experiences were in higher education? So, I spent quite a bit of time talking to students and, trying to unpack what they were trying to tell me about what their experiences were. And here are a list of some of the things that have come up in the past, but also have come up again in this series of interviews that I'm doing. And I've added a little bit more to my work as I've worked as an administrator, but I also work as a director and a professor and so forth. So I'm in touch with a lot of Indigenous students as well as other Indigenous faculty. But one of the things that we see, and probably we're seeing more of this right now, is the whole thing around questioning authenticity. But in the early day when they were talking about, they talked about their identities being questioned, Indigenous peoples, like students in the classroom, for example, if they weren't able to answer all things Indigenous or talk about any of the history around Indigenous people, their whole identity and authenticity as an Indigenous person often gets called into question. Like, so you can't be really an Indigenous person if you don't know kind of the history. Like if for example, somebody asked me the history of BC and Indigenous people, and I couldn't answer it in the classroom, my authenticity could get called into question. But when you think about the ridiculousness of that sort of question being posed on a student who's in a place of learning and is there to learn as well, those kinds of questions that then get asked of students, Indigenous students in particular, and frames them in a particular way that calls into question their authenticity. So it's actually one way that racism operates within a system, one that we don't often equate with racism. Another one is that you see quite a bit of is that you're not really an academic, or you're not capable of being in the academy. There were many students that talked about, people calling into question about how they arrived there. Did they get there by some kind of special program, some kind of admission criteria, and so forth. So their legitimacy to being there actually gets called into question as well. Another aspect is expecting to be taking on the role of the Indian expert, which is like being the Indigenous expert for all things. Some professors call out an Indigenous student in a classroom and ask them specific questions about being Indigenous, or maybe it might be a cultural question and so forth, and expect them to answer it as if they were the expert and not the student in the classroom. Tokenism, so getting invited to participate in something but being the only Indigenous person there, and being again expected to talk about all things Indigenous. There's denial that racism even exists. So when Indigenous students talk about some of the racism that they do experience, people say it can't be that bad. You're here, so there's this denialism that goes on. There's examples of being silenced and just being shut down in a classroom. And so the list goes on. You're not intelligent enough, or you're unprepared. There's a notion that Indigenous studies classes or Indigenous-based courses are not real academic classes or content. there's also this separation that happens within a lot of spaces within the academy where you are not to bring your emotional self to work. I can venture to guess that many people have heard this, leave your emotional baggage at the door, because we're just going to focus on content here. And for Indigenous students who come from a different worldview, which is based in holism, that's a real difficult to do, because you're asking them to separate their mind, body, and spirit and only bring their mind to the classroom, which is another form of violence that's put on people. And that's how I define it in my work. And then more recently, I heard this notion that we shouldn't even be using terms like decolonization because they're too harsh to think about. So I was kind of like surprised, just added it here to start looking at some of the more recent negotiations that Indigenous students and faculty members are experiencing within the academy. Indigenous instructors or Indigenous professors face a lot of the similar types of forms of racism operating, like around their authenticity as Indigenous people, how they got there. You didn't really get through your PhD program by actually doing a really great PhD. You just kind of squeak by. They get called into question when they're in the classroom. There's expectations that are put on Indigenous instructors that they're going to perform some kind of cultural ceremony or something. And when they don't, then their students are disappointed in them. And so it shows up on their evaluations, for example. And so these are just some of the different ways that overt and covert racism and discrimination kind of finds itself in the classroom. There are stereotypes that get perpetuated about who's Indigenous, that we're all homogeneous, and that we aren't diverse. And in fact, we are diverse. And I think a place like BC should probably be aware of the diversity of First Nations, because they have probably the most diversity of First Nations than all of the rest of Canada. I talked about authenticity, this notion that you're not really an academic, you're not intelligent enough to be there as well, kind of gets floated around. And then expectations of being an expert on all things Indigenous. So, and we still get that. We still get calls about, like my area is education and health, and I get asked all kinds of questions that are outside of my discipline that people kind of expect you to answer, but and they are kind of disappointed when you can't, or you get asked to sit on a research project as the only Indigenous person, which is kind of a tokenistic gesture. And then when you say no, like I've been like gotten silence, from them, like they don't talk to you after that. And it's kind of like, you must have put them off because people think that they're giving you a gift by putting you on a research project. But when it's not in your area, it's very difficult for us to say yes. And we realize too, as Indigenous professors, that we are being asked as a tokenistic gesture, right? So I'm going to shift into some of the strategies that we can think about too, going forward around decolonization. So first, I just want to reiterate the importance of understanding how colonization is linked and how it impacts the spaces like the academy. So, and thinking about that more deeply than what we do, I think. Divesting power and control and providing meaningful opportunities for engagement, really extremely difficult to do because the academy is controlled by, the Board of Governors, the Senate, faculties, and so forth. So it's very difficult for any one of those groups to give up any of their power or to invite another voice to the table or voices to the table, and engage in some kind of meaningful opportunities. From an Indigenous perspective, there's also structural challenges that exist that need to be thought about. So like, governance models that have been around for, like, I want to say ancient times, need to be rethought of, right? How do we do governance where we can be more inclusive and people are involved in the decision making that happens within the institution? How do we address underrepresentation of Indigenous people, both within like the student body as well as within faculty and staff? What are the curriculum and pedagogical things that need to be addressed around decolonization? And then also thinking about how we create more supportive environments for Indigenous students. But sometimes what gets lost in all of this is there also needs to be supportive environments for Indigenous faculty to survive within a very kind of colonial system that often is in conflict with their own worldview about how things are done and so forth. And many Indigenous professors are first generation professors, you know, like they don't have other professors in their family or instructors in their family that can help them navigate those kinds of systems. So for students, and you probably see this in a lot of institutions now where they're working at creating more welcoming spaces for Indigenous students. We see a lot of work being done in Indigenous student affairs offices. There's usually like some space that's dedicated for Indigenous students now. And those are really critical places and spaces for Indigenous students because they become places of safety for an Indigenous student. So if they are experiencing challenges with, say, for instance, racism. I've had students talk to me about how they might have experienced racism in the classroom. And the first place that they leave and go to when they leave the classroom is they go straight to Indigenous student affairs offices where they can just sit. They can talk to somebody if they feel like it. They don't have to talk to anybody, but they feel a sense of safety within those spaces. So we often get questioned about why we want those spaces. People question why can't they just use regular student affairs spaces, but they're really still very much needed and very critical. Access to traditional supports like elders, counselors, and so forth. Thinking about in classroom spaces, for example, curriculum, pedagogy in the classroom, you know, land-based education is becoming very much a focus in, for example, in Indigenous educational studies, but also in other disciplines as well. But having a general knowledge and understanding of experiences that Indigenous peoples have experienced over time and the impact that it's had on their life is really critical. So knowing who your students are in your classroom, and I know this is probably really challenging at places like UBC or U of Toronto, even at York University where I was, where, you know, the student body is made up of 55,000 students plus, right? And so you're teaching large classes, but you can guarantee that there's probably an Indigenous student or Indigenous students in those classrooms as well. So just being mindful of that and understanding the language that you're using. If difficult content is being taught, thinking about how the delivery of the difficult content is being delivered. You know, I've had students talk to me about when professors are teaching about, say, for instance, the residential schools, they're not given a whole lot of information or, you know, supports leading up to that. And they find it really difficult to sit through classes that talk about probably their families oftentimes, you know, might have been their parents or their grandparents that went through residential school. And so you become the object of the discussion. And then if you think about the classroom then as a colonized space, and imagine all the conversation and the discourse that goes on around the residential schools, for example, the questions that get asked can be harmful to an Indigenous student that's sitting in the classroom because you're talking about their family member, essentially. And I've heard Indigenous students talk about how difficult that can be for them. So I know in more recent interviews that I've done with some Indigenous professors, I know that they excuse or they don't expect Indigenous students to come to those classrooms, or they give them opportunities to leave the classroom without question. And they try to build in avenues that they can get the supports that they need, because we still need to talk about them, right? We still need to understand the history of the residential schools, for example, and the impact that it's had, or even say, for instance, the history of the social welfare system or the criminal justice system. Creating opportunities to debrief difficult content in your classroom becomes really important, and just being acknowledged and validated. So these are some of the things that can be done particularly for students. This notion also that everybody needs to learn about what colonization is, and the fact that it still remains ongoing, because there's like this myth that exists out there that colonization is a thing of the past, and it's often talked about in that way. So these are, oh, sorry. These are some other things in higher ed to think about, when we're thinking about the student, and we're trying to decolonize the system. We need to think about the decolonization from the perspective of the life cycle of a student. So it's not just about what happens in the classroom once they get there, but what about recruitment, and what happens at graduation and beyond? What are the options for programs, for example? How are students navigating requirements to get into university and some of the admission processes? And one notion that's often talked about is, oh, there's a high failure rate, for Indigenous students in post-secondary education. So trying to shift the discourse and flip it is really important, because, it's okay if students leave and come back another time. The measurements of success versus failure tend to be very, very like there's a line, right? If you leave university, you're viewed as a failure if you don't leave with a degree. But if you look at the life of some of the Indigenous students, and what's happening in some of the Indigenous communities and some of the things that they might be dealing with in their families or within their communities, this back and forth from university to community and university and back to community is kind of almost a natural part of the way many Indigenous students complete their education. So it's not kind of a linear trajectory that they would often take. There is this back and forth. And so I think we need to shift that discourse about, oh, you failed, or but rather looking at success in a different way. And I think the same thing goes for kind of assessments and evaluation, that we need to start thinking about more positive ways to think about success. There's different things also that can be done at the organizational level. I talked a little bit about what can be done at the student level. Things to think about is, who's doing the talking in classrooms, who's doing the talking at meetings, who's doing the listening, who's present, and then who's not present within these meetings, within systems, within classrooms, become really important. I always think about too, that if you see racism or you see stereotyping of people or myths, that it's our responsibility to stand up and say something about it. And, sometimes it's difficult and challenging, and I get that too. So, but wherever possible, we should be trying to counter, kind of stereotypical myths about Indigenous people. Ensuring that we take our own anti-racism and decolonizing education, and then think about when you're at meetings or when you're participating in group or you're in classrooms, for example, how do you divest the power and the control that goes on within, say, group work, for example? Simple things like group work. Oftentimes, students are put in a very competitive type of environment to produce something in a group, right? And so what ends up happening is a few people, and I've been part of lots of groups, because the whole MBA program that I went through is premised on group activities. And what it often happens is there's a couple of people that emerge that tend to be more vocal and kind of end up leading the group. But when you think, if you step back and think about it, how can you as an individual create more opportunities so that everybody is participating and there's meaningful opportunities for engagement within that? So just simple things like that become really important. And I really like Leanne Simpson's work around resurgence and how she talks about, all these little bits that we do to reclaim ourselves as Indigenous people are also really important to decolonization. So, learning little bits of our language, learning, about our culture and so forth. Those are all opportunities that we can create for Indigenous learners, for example. More broadly, and I think I've covered some of this, it's important to think about representation within the student body, the teaching and the administration, building in the conditions for success. Don't just create space and say, well, we open the door, but make it relevant and make it meaningful and make it lasting. Supports to engage with Indigenous knowledge and pedagogies, for example. And then there's the need to think about also research and how research is carried out. And we're just kind of like hitting the tip of the iceberg with that, with some of the changes to the Tri-Council ethical guidelines, the institution of the OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and possession. But there's work to be done, for example, on Research Ethics Board. And I know that York University just started to implement an all Indigenous Research Ethics Board that's a standalone from the regular Research Ethics Board of the university. And they review all the research that's being done with Indigenous people. And they have a combination of Indigenous scholars on there, but also students, and they have community, I think, representation as well as elders. And the people from the community are compensated to come in to do that because scholars within the institution are already paid. And then there's honorariums provided to the students that participate in that. So it'll be interesting to see how that whole piece evolves within the system. I think I talked about these other pieces as well, about recognizing that there's multiple ways of understanding the world. There's not only one particular way. And so recognizing that Indigenous peoples have their own ways of knowing, and there's multiple ways of knowing within Indigenous peoples, because we are not homogeneous. So as a result, there'll be multiple methodologies that come out of that as well. So that's it. I pretty well tried to cover my entire book in what, 45 minutes. But these are some of the books that I draw on for my presentation. Most of the work comes from colonized classrooms, but the decolonizing pieces are coming from more recent literature, as well as the interviews that I'm engaged in right now. So thank you very much for having me here. I think we have a bit of a Q&A, right?
Yes, we do. Thank you very, very much
Okay.
for that. That was fascinating. And I'm sure we have a couple of questions. If you do have a question for Dr. Cote Meek, please feel free to put your hand up, and I can take them in order. If you would rather ask a question over chat, feel free to message me as well, and I can ask the question.
Have I taken down my PowerPoint?
Your PowerPoint is down now. That's right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Because
Yeah.
I can't see it. Okay. Good.
I suppose I have a question, and it speaks to a point that you made earlier in your talk about how sort of the need to acknowledge the First Nations as a diverse group of people. And, you know, in BC, we've got over 200 First Nations groups. And thinking a little bit of the history behind the terminology First Nations, it was used to kind of get away from bad stereotypes associated with Indian. And also, I think the intention was to acknowledge the diversity within groups. But I can also see that using a single term like First Nations to refer to hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of different groups may itself create some homogeneity or perceptions of homogeneity. Do you have any idea or any thoughts on how we can go about sort of explicitly acknowledging the diversity within the groups, kind of either changing the language or how we use the language that we have today?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's a lot of discussions going on even with the term Indigenous, because it's conflated all Indigenous people into this one term, right? And so there's this move now, even within institutions, to talk about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit versus using the term Indigenous for exactly those reasons. But I think one of the things that's really important is to use the language of the local First Nation that you're on, you know. So if like, so for example, when I worked at Laurentian University, we were located on the traditional territory of the Atitmaching First Nation. So in the land acknowledgement, we referred directly to that First Nation as distinct, right? And so but if there's multiple First Nations, that's where the grouping happens, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes a little bit more challenging, but I think it's probably safe to say wherever possible, use either the local language or refer to the local First Nations by their proper name. And you'll notice that when I thank you for saying using the terminology right, that's really important to people, right? You know, that
Yeah.
you've taken that extra effort to learn how to say the name properly. And so that becomes really important. And, you know, like I've seen like board of governors who have been around for like years within an institution and still can't say words like Haudenosaunee, you
Yeah.
know. And so really making an extra effort to use that language.
Then sort of sticking on language, if I may, and then I'm happy to pass the questions over. Um, I've been playing, or I've been thinking about the idea of learning a little bit of, I think the Musqueam, I'm going to now mispronounce the name of the language, but the Musqueam, I speak, the language is Hunkamanum. I've been thinking of trying to do sort of not only land acknowledgement, but also greeting, very much like I enjoyed the greeting that you did at the beginning, because often I quite find that there's a lot of beautiful sentiment wrapped up in how a language sort of greets and welcomes people. I am not sure, however, how that would sort of go over in terms of whether it would be seen as an inclusive practice or once again overstretching where things, and once again not meaning to sort of treat you as the single expert on this, but do you have any thoughts on sort of using some of the local languages as part of the land acknowledgement and greeting?
Yeah, I don't know the context in BC,
Yeah,
so like, and I don't know the First Nations there to speak about that, but I can say,
absolutely.
you know, here and from my own personal perspective, you know, I've always appreciated when people make an extra effort to talk and use some of the local language if they can. You know, like more recently, we're like even at our institution, I'm seeing some folks talk about more deeply what the land acknowledgement actually means, because there's this kind of trend that people just read off the land acknowledgement, and it's kind of become very rote without like there's not a lot of meaning attached to it, right? So in an effort to try to put meaning to it, people are trying to talk a little bit more critically about what that means to be on a particular nation's lands that were stolen from them, right? And like you said, they're unseated. So I think, I think using the language where you can becomes really important. But again, I think it's kind of like doing it from your heart and doing it from a good place is probably the best way to say it, because a tokenistic kind of performative gesture um, is seen through really quickly by Indigenous people.
Right.
I mean, I can see it. And so, but how you walk and how you talk when you leave that kind of, when you've done that and move into something else, do you carry that practice on in your work? You know, being respectful to Indigenous people, trying to be more inclusive in your life and so forth, and in the work that you do. So do you see, like, sometimes there's like a disconnect? People will do really good with a land acknowledgement, use a language, but then when they go into making decisions, you don't see any kind of inclusivity following through. So I think it's like that whole piece about walking your talk, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to use it, do it in a good way and do it from, you know, a good place, and do it from your heart. That's my own personal opinion. I just want to be clear. I'm not speaking for all Indigenous people.
No, absolutely. And I realized that I did that thing when you talk where you treat one person as the expert for everyone. So
yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, here, because I've been brought in to do a presentation, but I just want to be clear too that, you know, I'm very respectful of recognizing that you're on a different land than I am right now.
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Catherine, you have your hand up.
Yes, for some reason, I can't turn on video, so I will just speak. But thank you so much for this talk. I work in the psychology department as a professor, and I also have a role on Senate, and I've kind of played various roles in between. And so one of the questions that I have is, in thinking about your work with administrations and and different committees, I'm wondering if you have any examples that come to mind of successful efforts to shift cultures or committees or any kind of part of these big organizations in terms of these divesting power and like actually succeeding in these kinds of recommendations that you have put forward. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I don't know if I have any really great examples to tell you the truth about.
Fair enough.
I think I think the whole issue around governance models is we're just on the fringes of trying to work through that now, and what that actually means, because I think what's happened a lot across Canada, and I'm talking about mostly mainstream post-secondary institutions. I'm not talking about places like First Nations University, for example, or other tribal post-secondary institutes. But in mainstream institutions, typically what's been happening across the board is that the institution seems to have recognized that they need kind of an Indigenous lead, for example. So a lot of institutions now have either a vice provost of Indigenous initiatives or some form of director that sits in administration, right? And I think I was in one of those roles. I think one of the very early roles. I think UBC might have been the first one that had such a role as the director of the First Nations Longhouse. If I'm not, I hope I have the right language, but a lot of other institutions followed suit with AVP types of roles, and that was a really great first step in trying to one, shift the administration, but also the shifting of moving everything that was focused only on the Indigenous student, like, so there was Indigenous Student Affairs created, and they provided supports for Indigenous students at a lot of institutions, but there was nothing that was happening in the faculties. There wasn't anything happening with curriculum. There still wasn't Indigenous faculty members there. And so there was a shifting that happened, I think around, I'll say it probably started to happen around 2006 onward, where the shift moved away from just focusing solely on student services to focusing on administration, but also focusing on faculty. So that's probably one of the successes, I guess, was to see that shifting happen in the academy. Part of the issue now, though, is that there's a whole lot of expectations that have been put on kind of these 1 or 2 senior administrative roles to do all the decolonizing and indigenizing work for the whole academy. And so the responsibility rests with them, but they don't have adequate resources to do so. So that's one thing that's happened. In some of the, I'll say, smaller institutions, you can see there's a link, for example, between the Board of Governors and Senate as on the Indigenous advisory councils that have been put in place in most institutions. So for example, at Laurentian University, they had a seat from the Board of Governors. So a Board of Governors was appointed to the Indigenous Educational Council, and Senate had an appointment. And then the reverse happened. The Indigenous Education Council appointed somebody to both of those places as well. So there was some linkages happening back to Senate and the board with that Indigenous Education Council. But I think you still have to remember that it was still an Indigenous Education Advisory Council. So councils that are advisory in nature don't have a lot of decision-making power. They can only provide advice, right, and input. So even though they had a seat on Senate and a seat on the board, they're one of many people on there with not a lot of, I mean, it changed some of it, right? I think it was a start, but I think there's some more work to be done. I hope you're able to follow what I was trying to.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And we do have some movement happening at UBC with different kind of offices and growth in Indigenous initiatives, groups and leadership and advisory teams. So that what you're talking about really kind of resonates with what I'm observing is happening here. But I find it interesting that the thinking about the link between like actually appointing, having someone from Senate on an advisory council and vice versa, like having that communication reciprocal. That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, that's just one model too, right?
Yeah.
It worked at Laurentian, but it might not work in other institutions. It really depends on the context. And I think because you have so many First Nations communities in BC, that might be a little bit challenging as well. I don't know the context enough to know how that could work really well. But so there is talk about Indigenous governance at institutions now. And the other thing that I think that's really important, at least from my perspective, is that was that there was a document that was put out in, I think, 1972 in response to kind of what was happening in the education system and how Indigenous peoples didn't have any control over what was happening to students when they got into the educational system. So they put out this document called Indian Control of Indian Education. And so, so one of the primary principles around that document is around self-determination, which is actually linked to, having a say, a meaningful say around the decisions that affect Indigenous peoples in education systems. And so you know, in my own work as an administrator, I often thought about that document in the work that I was doing and trying to mobilize change, you know, within institutions. And it also, you know, reminded me about the overall goals that we have as Indigenous people in our education. And it is about having some control, having a say in what happens to our people when they're in these systems, right? So part of it we need to be thinking about how do we divest power and control so that Indigenous peoples have more say in what's happening in these institutions.
Right. Thank you.
We have another question from the chat. Do you think the application of some of these guiding principles looks different depending on the discipline in the psychology classroom versus engineering versus mathematics versus creative writing? In what ways do you think there are commonalities and what ways are there differences, if any, across these varied types of classrooms and disciplines?
I imagine that they are, but I haven't done research into what looks different in different kinds of classrooms. But I can tell you that I've interviewed students as well as professors, Indigenous, from a variety of different disciplines. And I can tell you in terms of my own research that what they describe oftentimes very similar. You know, so for example, I was talking to a student in a discipline that I had no familiarity with, but she was talking about, you know, she was in she was in music, right? And they had one class, or one course, I guess, that was supposed to focus on Indigenous music. And it was being taught by somebody who is non-Indigenous, which I guess can be fine in some instances if they have the background, but apparently had no background in it. And it became reduced to a very kind of simple and mediocre kind of class, much to the dismay of the Indigenous student. And so her experience in that classroom was one where she felt silenced and marginalized in her ability to learn about that. Might be different experience in, say, engineering, you know, or in health. And I think some disciplines, from my own kind of view, I guess, are a little more advanced at decolonizing work than others. And not to pick on the sciences, but the sciences tend to be a little bit behind, say, for example, faculties of education who have been talking about indigenizing and decolonizing education for a number of years now. So that's just a personal opinion. I have no research to back that up.
Well, thank you very much for that. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Megan.
Hi, Sheila. I'm not in an area where I can turn on my camera. It's very busy here, so I'll just leave myself turned off. But UBC has, in the education department, a specialized teacher education program, namely the Indigenous teacher education program, that is specifically for Indigenous students wanting to pursue a career in teaching. And I guess from an anecdotal stance, met a really great girl on the bus, actually, in Vancouver, who is in this program. And from her perspective, she was telling me that this program that she's a part of was developed specifically so that Indigenous students, and again, sorry, Vancouver consists of mostly the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm not specifically which community she's a part of, but she said it was meant for more Indigenous students to have access into this specific field and to encourage these careers. Sorry, so my specific question is not to kind of downplay the work that the UBC community has done to diversify programs and allow access, but to what degree do you feel that this maybe perpetuates division rather than inclusion? Just as some further context, I'm involved in some work right now that tries to push a more universal approach in curriculum specifically regarding neurodivergence or other learning needs. And so I'm just curious, if we're creating programs like this program at UBC, for example, is specifically for Indigenous students. I just wonder, and I'd love your opinion, again, to what degree does this kind of perpetuate division rather than just, allow all programs to be flexible, allow all programs to involve Indigenous learning?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I'm sure it crosses a lot of people's minds. And then I think too, what happens is sometimes Indigenous-based programs, and I know this for a fact from the research that I did, are viewed as less than other programs, right? So that's the kind of the view that's taken up about them, which actually harms the program because they're not any less than any other program, like an Indigenous social work program or an Indigenous teacher ed program, for example. Do I think that they perpetuate division? And I don't think so. I think in this day and age, we still need those kinds of access types of programs where where the curriculum is relevant, it's meaningful, it's taught by oftentimes Indigenous professors or Indigenous scholars. Their placements, for example, are Indigenous communities oftentimes, so they have a really strong sense of their context and so forth. And I don't know about the question about universal types of programs. Do they really actually exist? We like to think that we've created accessibility, for example, and universal accessibility, right? Or we have accessibility for students no matter what, and I don't think we're there. So, and the other thing is, what happens in mainstream programs? Like, I think mainstream programs probably, if you were trying to provide an education for somebody that's going to go work in a First Nations community, do they get enough of kind of the context that they're going to be working in within a mainstream environment? Regardless, so I still think that there's still a lot of room for that. I don't think it necessarily creates divisions, but I think there's a discourse that operates that creates that division that's actually rooted in racism. And so yeah, it's a good question though. I just don't think that the world is as accessible, or this concept of universal, I can't even say it, universal accessibility actually exists. It's really interesting.
No, thank you.
Just a quick story. This is like probably a little off topic, but because I have a bee in my bonnet right now about accessibility, like physical accessibility, for example. So, my father recently has had like diminishing health, right? And so he's had to use a walker. And then when I take him out, he has to go in a wheelchair. So, you call ahead and you ask if the place is accessible, right? And they go, oh yeah, come on over. And so we go into a restaurant, and the first thing that we have to go over is this huge curb, that's about 2 inches over. And I'm pushing, a 200-pound male in a wheelchair, and I'm expected to be able to lift him over that with the wheelchair. And so, I've realized how inaccessible this world is, even just around physicality. So I have a bit of a bee in my bonnet now about this whole thing about, how accessible are we? So when I transfer that to education and this, this concept about universal access, I think we have so much work to do to create a society that's in that area, that we still have to have room for places like Indigenous student services, where there's safe spaces, where Indigenous teachers can learn how to be Indigenous teachers for their own communities. That's where they're planning to work. That's where they're going to stay. They have no aspirations to go out and work in the mainstream world. That's their focus. So anyway, just another thought. Sorry if I digressed a bit.
No, thank you very much for that. We do have another question from the chat. Group work sometimes seems so risky for some students that maybe it's better to avoid it. In case we want to try, do you have any advice about how to help students divest power in their group work?
Yeah, interesting. I don't really have like a great solution for that. I came from a program that all we did was group work. I think some of the things that we can think about as professors is how we set those groups up. And what kinds of expectations we expect from the students in the groups, right? So the lead up to putting students in groups, some of the things that you can think about, are, making sure that everybody has a voice in the group. If, like in the classes that I've taught, I use, like in physical classes at least, used concepts around circle and circle work, which allow a student to participate. If you go around a circle, they can decline or not. So you give people options. And if you can build that into your class and provide like teaching so that the students can pick up that kind of way of working with people, it might be helpful. Even in my administrative responsibilities, like I had a diverse group of direct reports at one time and varying levels of responsibility within an institution. And so if I was trying to figure out a way, how can I make sure that everybody that comes to the table and reports to me has a voice at that particular table? Because I had some people who would be viewed as kind of lower down the hierarchy than others. So say, for instance, I would have AVPs reporting to me and then maybe a coordinator or a manager in another program. And so people come to the table with different views, right? So you also have to be aware of what are the students bringing to the groups in terms of their own kind of worldview and how they understand how hierarchy works, how understanding how power and control works in groups and so forth. So, and trying to break down some of the kind of old ways that are inherent in some of the way that we do work with, right?
Right.
I don't know if that helps.
Andy, what feel free to ask.
Cool. I'll be the first that has success turning their video on too. So I want to talk about something that you mentioned in the beginning about one of the harms that's can be perpetuated is with this idea of asking students to check their emotions at the door. And I'm sort of thinking about that from a teacher's perspective. I can imagine there might be a lot of reason, and I'm not sure entirely what that means, but I can imagine, at least for myself, it's about having some kinds of boundaries around what kinds of information maybe gets shared. And I can imagine teachers might have a lot of reasons that they might want to have some kind of boundaries or emotions getting checked at the door. One could simply be that, it could be triggering for their own issues, and they're not prepared to kind of deal with that. Others might have different motivations where maybe they don't feel skilled or equipped or prepared to provide that kind of support, depending on the scale of what those emotions are, especially if it's centered around, past trauma that they, students that might want to share. And others might just, might be more of a mindset that's not really inclusive, but one such that's like, let's focus on business and, that it kind of, focus on the task at hand and not allow other things to get in the mix of that. And I imagine it's not a one size fits all kind of solution about, allow all motions through or block them out, but clearly blocking them out causes its own set of harm, but it seems complicated. And I'm just kind of curious if you have advice or perspective of what are, how you maybe prepare you know, there just seems like a range of what it could mean to allow emotions in, and I'm just not quite sure how to process that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's more complicated than saying, you know, bring your emotions with you, right? But I think that there's ways to do that you can still set boundaries within a classroom as long as everybody's clear about what the boundaries are, right? And I think thinking through what that means when you do set the boundaries, why you're setting them, versus, I mean, this is like kind of an old narrative, right? That was always delivered by professors in the university system, is that, you know, leave your baggage at the door. Because I was in a school of social work at one time. And believe it or not, I'm not a social worker, but anyway, but that was kind of the mantra was to leave your baggage at the door. We're only focusing at the task at hand. And so, but you're right. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than just saying that. And so they're like, but sometimes I think what happens is when we only think with the cognition, like we only focused on the job at hand, we're not thinking about the people that are within the class either. So we're just focusing about, you know, like a topic like residential schools, for example. Okay, leave your baggage at the door and no place for that. How do you talk about that without paying attention to the students in the classroom and what they're experiencing? And it can be both traumatic for an Indigenous student hearing that, but also can be traumatic for a non-Indigenous student who has to wrestle with, you know, what does that mean to them? What does it mean to their family and to the history that they thought they grew up with? So I think there's certain topics that we have to pay attention to the student and what's happening in the classroom as well. There are others, you know, if we set the boundaries and say, okay, for this particular class or for this particular exercise, this is kind of the boundaries that I need to put around this particular class. I think the professor has to be aware enough about all the possibilities of what happens, and, you know, and only doing what we're comfortable with, right? And I'm not suggesting also that professors become counselors, because that's not their job, right? And there's other places where students can access supports that they need, and being aware of where those supports are if students need them. I know that there's a big push now to put language on course syllabi that talks about trauma informed, and I know, like, we have these standard course syllabi that, like, I don't know, they're like 20 pages long now because they list all the resources and everything else that's covered off on them. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I do acknowledge that it is a lot more complicated than I made it sound.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. This is definitely helpful.
Yeah, and thanks for the question.
All right, I think that's bringing us up neatly to 10:02, and I know that a couple of colleagues have to run off to teach and to class and to carry on with their day. So I would like to thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise today. It was incredibly enlightening. It's given us a lot to think about and move forward, and we are very grateful for you coming in and sharing your expertise with us today. In many First Nation communities in BC, public gift giving is an important tradition, serving as a way to express gratitude. And so while this online setting kind of limits the way that we, you know, how we can fully honor this practice, we would still like to offer you a gift as a token of our appreciation, and I will connect with you offline to organize that. But thank you very much for coming today. It was very, very helpful, very enlightening for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Have a great day.
You too.